I never thought a stack of colorful store-bought receipts and a cheap plastic binder from Staples would be the only thing standing between me and a jail cell. But when you live in a neighborhood governed by someone like Margaret, you realize pretty quickly that logic is just a suggestion and her ego is the only law that actually matters. It started on a Tuesday, one of those perfectly ordinary afternoons where the air smells like fresh-cut grass, and the only thing on my mind was whether I had enough gas in the mower to finish the backyard. But then I saw it, this neon orange envelope taped right over the deadbolt of my front door, looking like a radioactive wound against the white paint. The words in quote, "Final notice" in quote, were stamped in a font so large and aggressive it felt like a physical shout. And as I stood there with my keys still in my hand, my heart started doing this slow, heavy thud against my ribs because I just knew, that Margaret had finally found a way to come for me. See, Margaret ISN and Oppos. T, just the president of our HOA here at Willow Creek. She's the kind of woman who treats the community bylaws like they're the Ten Commandments, and she's the one who brought them down from the mountain. Except she's also the kind of person who would fine you for having the wrong shade of beige on your curtains. I ripped the envelope open, my fingers shaking just a little bit, and scanned the document only to find a balance due that made my head spin. 4 months of unpaid dues plus a in quote, special assessment in quote, fee and a mountain of late penalties that added up to nearly $3,000. It was absurd. It was impossible because I'm the guy who pays his bills the second they hit the inbox, the guy who keeps every digital confirmation in a dedicated folder. Yet here was this official-looking paper telling the world I was a deadbeat. I spent that entire evening huddled over my kitchen table, the dim light of the overhead lamp reflecting off the glossy surfaces of my bank statements, and I went back through every single transaction for the last year, highlighting each in quote, Willow Creek HOA in quote, line item with a yellow marker until the pages looked like a neon garden. I had everything, the dates, the confirmation numbers, the exact minute the funds left my account. So I told myself it was just a glitch, a clerical error in some dusty database, and that I just talked to Margaret in the morning and we'd laugh it off over the fence. But the next morning, before I even had the chance to grab my coffee, I heard the unmistakable click-clack of high heels on my driveway, a sound that usually signals an incoming storm in this neighborhood. And when I opened the door, there she was. Margaret stood there with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, her face set in this expression of performative disappointment, the kind of look a Victorian headmistress gives a student who's been caught stealing apples. She didn't oppose to even say hello. She just gestured toward the orange envelope I was still holding and said, and quote, I assume you've seen the damage, Arthur, and frankly, the board is exhausted with the excuses, and quote, and her voice was loud, intentionally loud, carry across the lawns to where Mr. Henderson was picking up his newspaper and Mrs. Gable was watering her petunias. I tried to stay calm. I really did. I told her, and quote, Margaret, there's been a massive mistake. I have the records right here showing every payment cleared months ago, and quote, but she just gave me this thin, oily smirk and shook her head, saying, and quote, oh, they always have an oppos, records and oppos, don and oppos, they? But the system doesn't and oppos, lie, Arthur, and right now the system says you're a thief who's been living off the labor of your neighbors, and we aren't an oppos. Going to stand for it anymore, end quote. The next few days were a slow-motion car crash of social isolation because Margaret didn't oppose. Just stopped at the notice. She went on a literal crusade, whispering in ears at the community pool and sending out, in quote, status updates, in quote, to the neighborhood email list that didn't oppose. Named me explicitly but pointed a giant, flashing arrow at my house. People I'd known for 6 years, people I'd shared beers with during the 4th of July block party, started looking at their shoes when I walked by, and I could feel the atmosphere in the cul-de-sac curdling into something sour and suspicious. It's a special kind of hell when you're being gaslit by an entire organization, and I started second-guessing my own sanity, staring at my bank app until the numbers blurred, wondering if I had somehow hallucinated the last 6 months of fiscal responsibility. Then came the Friday from hell, the day the stakes stopped being about money and started being about my actual life, because as I was pulling into my driveway after a long shift, I saw the flashing blue and red lights reflected in my rearview mirror. My heart didn't oppose. Just sink. It turned into a lead weight in my chest as a local sheriff's deputy stepped out of his cruiser, looking tired and reluctant, while Margaret stood on the sidewalk like a victorious general, waving a stack of evidence and shouting that I was financial predator who needed to be removed from the premises. The deputy was a guy named Miller, someone I'd seen at the local diner, and he looked at the paperwork Margaret was shoving in his face with a skeptical squint, then looked at me and said, "Sir, the HOA is filing a criminal complaint for theft of services and fraud, claiming you've been falsifying payment records to avoid your dues." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. I couldn't into oppos to even find my voice for a second, but then the sheer, unadulterated rage started to boil up, replacing the fear with a cold, sharp clarity that I've never felt before. I looked past the deputy at Margaret, who was literally vibrating with this sick kind of glee, and I realized that she wasn't into oppos. Just mistaken. She was enjoying this. She wanted to see me in handcuffs because I was the only person on the board who ever pushed back against her ridiculous landscaping audits I told Deputy Miller, "Officer, if you give me 10 minutes, I can show you exactly why this woman is either delusional or a liar," And something in my tone must have reached him because he nodded and followed me inside, leaving Margaret fuming on the porch, screaming about how, criminals always have a story, Inside, I didn't oppose. To show him my bank app, I showed him the physical paper trail, but as we were looking at the HOA's own ledger that Margaret had provided, something caught my eye, a tiny insignificant detail that most people would miss, but because I'd spent 48 hours staring at these numbers, it jumped out at me like a neon sign. The account number listed for the delinquent payments wasn't an oppos. T-mine, well, it looked like mine, but the last two digits were swapped, and when I look at the header of the ledger, I realized the internal ID belonged to a different property entirely. I felt this chill go down my spine as I asked the deputy to wait, and I called the only person I knew who might actually have the keys to the kingdom, a guy named Leo, who used to be the HOA treasurer before Margaret bullied him into resigning. Leo was a quiet, nervous guy who lived 3 streets over, but when I told him what was happening and read him the account number on the delinquent ledger, there was this long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, and then he whispered "Arthur, you need to be very careful because that's not a typo. That's Margaret's personal house account." Everything clicked into place with the sickening sound of a trap snapping shut, and I realized the scale of the game Margaret was playing. She hadn't an oppos. T just made a mistake. She had been using the HOA's new automated software to reassign her own mounting debts to my address, thinking that with her control over the board, she could just bully me into paying her bills or ruin me so completely that no one would ever believe my side of the story. I looked at Deputy Miller and said, "We need to go to the community center right now," And even though he wasn't an oppos, T technically supposed to get involved in civil disputes, the look on his face told me he smelled something rotten too. We didn't oppos. T tell Margaret where we were going. We just left her standing there on my lawn, and we drove down to the records office where Leo met us with his old laptop and a set of backup files he'd kept just in case Margaret ever tried to cook the books. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that cramped, dusty office, peeling back the layers of Margaret's empire and what we found was even worse than I imagined. It wasn't oppos. Just my account she was tampering with. She had been skimming off the top of the beautification fund for years to pay for her own backyard renovation, and whenever the numbers didn't oppos add up, she just pinned a shortfall on a neighbor she didn't oppos like. The climax of this whole nightmare happened at the emergency HOA board meeting that Margaret had called for that Sunday, a meeting she intended to use as my public execution, a chance to officially vote on a lien against my house and ban me from the common areas. The room was packed, the air thick with the smell of cheap coffee and judgment, and Margaret was sitting at the front of the room behind a long mahogany table, looking like a queen on her throne, her gavel resting in front of her like a scepter. She started the meeting with this long, winding speech about, integrity, community trust, talking about how, in quote, painful, in quote, it was to have a, in quote, bad actor, in quote, in their midst, and she kept looking at me with this mock pity that made my skin crawl. When it was finally my turn to speak, I didn't oppose. To go to the podium with a defense, I went there with a projector and a laptop, and the moment I plugged it in and the first slide hit the screen, I saw the color drain from Margaret's face in a way that was more satisfying than any lottery win. I didn't oppose. To start with my payments, I started with the HOA's own audit logs, showing exactly when and where the account numbers had been, in quote, modified, in quote, by an administrator login, Margaret's login, and I walked the entire neighborhood through the process of how their, in quote, president, in quote, had been using my home as a piggy bank for her own unpaid dues. The room went from dead silent to a low, angry hum, like a disturbed hornet's nest, and as I flipped to the slides showing the, in quote, beautification fund, in quote, receipts being used at a high-end pool contractor for a private residence, people actually started standing up and shouting. Margaret tried to use her gavel. She was screaming about, in quote, slander, in quote, and, in quote, illegal hacking, in quote, but Deputy Miller was standing at the back of the room, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and the moment she tried to bolt for the exit, he just stepped in her path with a very calm, very professional shake of his head. It was the most beautiful, cinematic downfall I've ever witnessed. The woman who had tried to have me arrested for her own crimes was now the one being escorted out in front of the very people she had spent years terrorizing, her, in quote, empire of lies, in quote, dissolving into a puddle of digital evidence and bank statements. In the weeks that followed, the HOA was completely overhauled. Margaret ended up facing a laundry list of white-collar charges, and I became the, in quote, hero, in quote, of the neighborhood, though I didn't oppose. To really feel like one. I just felt like a guy who finally got to mow his lawn in peace. But the thing that stays with me, the thing that keeps me up sometimes, is how easily everyone turned on me just because a woman with a clipboard told them to. And it makes you wonder how many, in quote, Margaret's, in quote, are out there right now, ruining lives just because they have a little bit of petty power in a neon orange envelope. My house feels like a home again, but the silence in the cul-de-sac is different now. It's a bit more cautious, a bit more aware of the fact that the people who scream the loudest about, in quote, rules, in quote, are often the ones breaking every single one of them in the dark. So I have to ask you, if your community turned on you tomorrow based on a lie that looked like the truth, who would stand by you? Have you ever had a neighbor try to destroy your life just to save their own skin? And how far would you go to prove you were innocent if the, in quote, system, in quote, was rigged against you? Let me know in the comments, because I'm starting to think that the real villains aren't in oppos. The ones in the movies. They're the ones living in the colonial-style house 3 doors down, watching your every move.